You're listening to the Platform Engineering Podcast, your expert guide to the fascinating world of platform engineering. Each episode brings you in-depth interviews with industry experts and professionals who break down the intricacies of platform architecture, cloud operations, and DevOps practices. From tool reviews to valuable lessons from real-world projects to insights about the best approaches and strategies, you can count on this show to provide you with expert knowledge that will truly elevate your own journey in the world of platform engineering.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Platform Engineering Podcast. I'm Cory O'Daniel. With me is Colton Dempsey, a partner at Next47. Colton, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Cory. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I would love to learn a bit about your background in venture capital and particularly in the DevOps and platform engineering space. I really enjoyed the posts you wrote on is DevOps a rebrand or meaningful step forward? Is platform engineering a rebrand of DevOps or meaningful step forward? That's something that I have feared and hoped was not the case for most of my career, but would love to hear about your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I joined Next47 in 2018, and we're a B2B focused venture capital firm. So we invest in tools used by engineers and DevOps professionals, data teams, sales teams, marketing teams. So roles just across the enterprise. And I just have a particular love for the infrastructure side of things. So that's where I spend a majority of my time. And I came across platform engineering more so from my interactions with startups in the space. So I think I came across the startups probably before I heard about the term platform engineering. But as I did start to hear about it, I could see how some of these pieces fit together. And so I wrote that blog post to really that was the initial question. Is this a rebrand? That's what a lot of people were calling it. But I come out thinking platform engineering is a valuable pattern and approach. So it's been great diving into the space.
Yeah, we actually met at reInvent, and when we were there, it was funny the number of DevOps and platform engineers that I met that were very much concerned about this as well, like it just being another rebrand. I think that most of the industry understands that like the work's important, like the mission's important, but we've kind of been through this rebrand before. Like a lot of ops people felt like they got rebranded from ops to DevOps engineers, and then it happened again with SRE. And I think a lot of people are afraid of this happening again. How do you think that startups in this space can help make sure that this isn't just a rebrand and actually push this mission forward?
Sure. Yeah, I think some of the concern is around title, and I'm not sure that platform engineering has to be a title. I think there are 22,000 now platform engineers. I wrote the blog post about 6 months ago, so growing at a decent clip, but still fairly small. But I don't think teams necessarily need to call themselves something different. I view platform engineering as an approach that helps both developers and DevOps teams or platform engineers both operate more efficiently. So I don't think there's anything wrong in building products that actually help with that. And I'm not too concerned about it, but about like the rebrand piece, I think this will be valuable long term, but it's still very early, and startups are really figuring out what provides the most value and how to sell this appropriately, because it can definitely be tricky when you're selling to two different parties within an enterprise.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that one. And it's interesting because like when you look at some of the most successful companies in the world, like they're doing this, right? And I feel like when you look at FANG has platform engineers, Google, right? I mean, the clouds in and of themselves have done a lot of platform engineering so that they could extend the services to us as developers. So it's like you see that this is something that big companies have to do. And I feel like there's a lot of really large organizations out there that you may see them as antiquated, right? The grocery chains, some of the older brick and mortar now e-commerce sites, and banks, right? Like the things that we use every day as people, not just software engineers, that they need this, and they can actually have some of the most amount of struggle of trying to get this talent, right? And so I really do hope that it is a mission that people continue to push, and that we're successful in moving there. What the companies that you're investing in the platform engineering and DevOps sectors, like what is the most exciting about those sectors and those companies that keeps you interested?
Within infrastructure, it's incredibly complex, rich ecosystem of startups that's perpetually evolving. I think more so, the interdependency on other tech is, especially pronounced in this space, and the waves of adoption that we see of whether it's moving to the cloud or adopting Kubernetes, new things like serverless, create lots of new opportunities every day for new startups to emerge and claim a competitive advantage of versus the incumbents who weren't born in the cloud or designed for Kubernetes. So I think it's just the ever-changing nature of the space that gets me most excited. Within platform engineering, we haven't made an investment yet. It's not to say that we won't. We definitely are looking to do that. But yeah, it's still early days of the category, and I think there's some convergence that will happen. So excited to see how that develops. We have companies in our portfolio like Logs.io that work with the ELK stack, related to observability and monitoring. So I think that is can be a piece of platform engineering, and that's some of the challenge of building these platforms is how broad should they be and what should they encompass. And I think right now observability kind of operates a bit in its own lane. It's like a pretty well-defined category, but long term, I think that will absolutely is already being encompassed in some platform engineering tools. So still actively looking for interesting companies in platform engineering.
And how do you like identify a promising startup in the platform engineering or the DevOps space? Like what qualities are you looking for?
Yeah. To find them, there's lots of ways. A lot of them will be open source startups. So if you you can find them at events like KubeCon. A book I'm reading right now called Platform Engineering on Kubernetes. I think platform engineering is aiming to have developers take on a little bit more of the infrastructure work that DevOps traditionally has done a bit more manually, this time in a more productized approach. But you have to make it comfortable for them, for developers to take on that additional responsibility. And so it kind of seems like there needs to be an exchange where developers are maybe taking on more infrastructure and DevOps people or platform engineering teams are learning more code. So they both kind of convert. There's a bit of a trade there going on. So that balance is really important. And it's hard to give specific attributes we look for because I think there's so many exceptions. There's always an exception in the startup world. But at a high level, I think we're looking for great teams building a product that is either a huge leap above the performance of the incumbents in a defensible way. That way you're tackling an existing bucket of spend and a clearly defined budget. Or companies that have a totally unique vision of the world, maybe a more contrarian vision of the world that is just fundamentally disruptive, and may even not be as defensible as that previous example I mentioned. But the idea is you'll get such a head start that you'll be leading that way.
Yeah, and you mentioned the open source component. That's what I'm really curious about, especially from the VC point of view, with all the kind of shake up in the market over the past, year and a half. Does a good, successful open source project still have the same value as an investor, like when you're looking at an organization, or has that receded a bit?
I think I think open source, if you look across the platform engineering space, probably half or more of the startups, at least like in the landscape I made, have an open source approach. So I think it's definitely important and great, but it's not absolutely necessary. I think it provides a great pipeline for startups, great distribution, but you can also find projects or companies that have so much adoption and still are struggling to monetize. So when looking at open source, there are plenty of benefits, but really need to make sure that you are being intentional about what you're putting in the open source and what you're keeping proprietary. And I think some founders that come from the open source world, struggle with that a bit. But it's like you are a commercial entity, so ultimately, people won't fault you for it if you make it fair as possible. So I think there's a balance to strike of putting out an open source project that provides enough value that people get really excited about it, and but not so much that there's no ability to monetize. So having those paywalling strategies are important.
Yeah, and I feel like there's so many, especially with like the budget cycles you get on operations and DevOps teams. I feel like in large organizations I've worked in, like hopefully you get a quarterly one and don't get stuck with the annual budget you have to deal with. But like that open source is really the way for you to sneak something in under the radar, right? Where you don't have a budget for it yet, and try it out and kind of prove the value to the business. And so I've always seen that as a really important component of getting really good dev tooling or operations tooling like into a business. And so that's just something I've been thinking about with how much more pressure there is for startups to get bigger revenues before they get to Series A.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You have to be pretty intentional about it, and there's no rush necessarily to be open source from the start. You could be source available, or you can take time to figure out what components of my product are helpful to be open source. Maybe it's more of a format that you've developed, or some type of syntax that people can build things, and then so it's helpful to have that community. Other times, maybe you want the open source primarily for to put get some distribution, but definitely like to help enterprises be more comfortable being able to read the source code. There's a variety of different approaches you can take.
Awesome. And what startup categories do you think really embody that platform engineering mindset with the evolution of DevOps and platform engineering? Like where do you see these opportunities for innovation investment over the next couple of years?
Yeah. So I think, there are a few categories that are top of mind for me in platform engineering. One of them being internal developer portals, IDPs, or internal developer platforms. I'm not totally sure exactly the difference there, but Spotify has their Backstage product, which is a project which is known pretty well and serve kind of as either a list of services and who's responsible, or can serve as the jumping off point and the UI of the platform for people to spin up new resources and projects in a well-defined way. I also think there's categories like environments that are helping helping developers spin up more isolated, ephemeral environments rather than having a shared resource that can cause conflicts in the testing process. There's categories like platform orchestration that are, I see a variety of approaches there, but generally trying to help provide abstractions for developers to work with things like Kubernetes or work with cloud infrastructure more easily, either by defining how their application should work, like having some of that configuration up front and passing it over to the platform team, or then there are tools that, I kind of view Massdriver in this category that are more visual and actually is not just like a YAML format, but it's actually like a real product you can interact with. Infrastructure as code, I think it fits in this category pretty well. There are hosting tools. If you think about companies like Vercel that are essentially enabling smaller teams or developers to provide their code, and Vercel really handles the rest with things like hosting. So there are tools like that tend to focus more maybe on the SMB side. Incident management, I think, as well, is emerging category. Although I think it's been around forever, but the workflow, I see more and more workflow tools getting built up. So those were like the 5 categories that I initially identified, but there were lots of debates that we had about other spaces, like build tools, like should that be included, or CI/CD tools. For build tools, we had seen those more companies have developers really owning that in part already. So maybe not embodying as much of like taking something that traditionally was DevOps and making it a developer responsibility. But and then the CI/CD tools, not sure exactly if developers are still getting super involved in that yet, but you definitely see some interesting companies coming out with higher level abstractions that can help there. But I'd be curious your opinion, like what belongs in a platform? Do build tools belong in a platform? Does observability belong in internal developer platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, because I think that you can put a lot of stuff in a platform, and our product is obviously in the space, and I've used a fair number of our competitors' products. I'm friends with a lot of those people, and it's like our products are very different, right? And the reality is like organizations are very different. Like nobody's product in the space is going to be able to sell it to everybody. But it's funny, like even within an organization, like our teams are very different, right? You mentioned Vercel earlier, right? We use Vercel. We have a team, like we run Massdriver on Massdriver, but we also use Vercel. Vercel is the only thing that we use outside of Massdriver, and it's because it is fantastic for our front end team, right? And I think that one of the things that's a little, I guess, worrisome is I see some companies talking about like, oh, you need an IDP, like 80 to 90% of your team should be using it. And it's like, that's not a real expectation. Like we can't expect the AI and ML teams to use the same platform that our backend teams using, and the same platform that our front end teams using. So I think that, as far as like the tooling and functionality that will be in these platforms is really going to depend on the team that's using it. And I think that we're going to see that, teams are going to start to coalesce around like specific platforms based on their function. I think what's really interesting though, as far as like the bigger players in the space is who can expand here. And I think that you're seeing a lot of organizations that were a DevOps tool starting to use platform language. Everybody's talking about self-service and DevX now. Everybody's trying to get a piece of this, the pie that we're baking kind of in this platform engineering market. And I'm really curious what kind of behemoths in the space are going to start to do some of the work and some of the functionality that you're seeing a lot of the startups implementing. So I think that'll be pretty interesting there. And I think that's, as a startup, I think it's a little scary to think of maybe a HashiCorp moving into the platform engineering space. But again, like I don't think that there's a tool that every single person at every single organization is going to want to use. And I think that when we start to see some of these bigger, IAC environments, deployment management, incident management start to have some of this functionality, I think it's going to really validate the space. I think this is something that, like, again, we see Fang doing it, and people that have like suffered and been in this space or worked in this space like understand the value of it. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see some of these bigger companies start to use this terminology, our language, and start to implement some of these features, because that's just going to make the pie much bigger for everybody else in the space.
Certainly. I feel bad for all the people who are upset by the platform engineering branding, because they'll probably be hearing a lot more of it over the next few years.
Yeah. And I think that early on, I think that I feel like, I've been an operations and DevOps engineer for going on 20 years now. And then I was in data centers before that. I feel like there's a lot of tooling that's been jammed down our throats for 20 years. And it's like, we have a hard job and we're always outnumbered, right? It's like, oh, they have 3, 4, 5 ops people and 200 engineers. It's like, it's really hard to get a good DevOps culture when you're constantly struggling for budget and like you're not seen as a direct value add to the product in a lot of organizations.
I have a question on that. Have you noticed that being on DevOps teams, how does your budget compare to the budget of the engineering team?
Well, it's really funny how it works. It depends on if there's good like cost controls in the org, right? So like a lot of orgs, I think especially early on, all of the cloud costs just end up rolling up to the DevOps team, right? And so it looks like a big budget, but the reality is you're running your developers' infrastructure. And I think as you get more mature, it's boring to talk about, but like having good cost controls and attribution of costs like for your resources really gives people an idea of like who's spending the most. Like, oh, I can see that there's $100,000 of spend a month for the backend team, and there's maybe $500,000 a month of storage and processing and ETL for the data team. So I think that once you get to that state where you have good cost controls and you can see where people's costs are in the cloud, that's where you start to see the DevOps team has a very small budget, right? It's like we have a handful of engineers compared to what is on the product team. And again, that's customer facing, that makes sense. But I think that you're outnumbered staff-wise and outnumbered on the budget, like time and time again. And I think that's something that I think is going to be hard for a lot of DevOps teams that want to move to platform engineering. People that aren't having it shoved down their throat is they have to somehow show value, whether that's through, another buzzword, the thinnest viable product, or, MVP, or through just doing really good DevOps culture in your org. Like we got to show value so the business sees that value add that we're giving so that we can start to open up that budget. I don't think we do a good job of that, right? We're so far from the product. We're so far from product management. I haven't seen a lot of teams like lean into like really doing that DevOps work, like seeing what their engineering customers need, surveying people, right? Like figuring out like how you can actually be a force multiplier for your engineering team versus like just doing debt. And I don't think that they necessarily are doing that on purpose. I think a lot of them are just dealing with debt, right? Like you get brought in as the first ops person, like 3 or 4 years into a project. And like day one, you've got a lot of work to do before you can start even, adding that value. So the budgets, I feel like tend to be a lot less when you're not counting the entire cloud into it. And I think something people are still struggling with. There was a recent Gartner report on how a lot of these DevOps teams are trying to now figure out how to consolidate tooling because now they've got 27 different tools. They're paying $50,000 a year for this one, $100,000 a year for this one. And so it's like their budget is getting spread out to all these tools that solve a single problem. So now they're looking for, okay, who can solve 3 of my problems so I can consolidate some of my budget on one vendor, right? And get some of that money back so I can hire another teammate, right? And I think that's why you're starting to see a lot of these bigger organizations start to have these diverse feature sets. It's like if they can, if somebody like Logs can start to do tracing as well, it's like, okay, well, maybe I'll use them for my logs and tracing instead of buying, a light step or running Hotel or Jaeger myself.
Yeah, I think it's certainly been over the past 2 years, a lot of interest in consolidation and cost optimization. So definitely seeing a lot of tools emerge in that space. And yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that the DevOps budget, may seem large, but when you really get down to it and attribute everything, it's not as large as you may think. And I think I still think this is probably the right approach, but a lot of platform engineering tools will try to market to maybe developers with their open source and then sell to the DevOps team, and actually monetize with governance features. But it's very difficult to get, developers super excited about adding a lot more governance features to some product that they already like. And so you're kind of pitching 2 different value props. And how do you kind of combine that? How do you pitch both velocity to developers and control to DevOps teams? And I know that it's not the only thing DevOps teams are concerned with, but that is like a typical tried and true method of selling that type of ROI.
Yeah, and it's funny, like when you just look at like, a common like ratio that we threw out there. Like I think, depending on what blog post you read, but you'll see people say like 1 to 10 is good, like DevOps or operations to engineers, and you'll see some people say like 1 to 7. You see a lot of times like companies realistically have like 1 to 20, right? But like that right there, when you just look at like people power, like you can see that there is 7 times the budget for engineers, right? Or 10 or 20 times the budget just for people, like let alone their tooling. So I think that, a lot of times we struggle for that budget, and we have to be like sensible about like how we're spending it, right? If I buy, 2 different tools for 2 very specific use cases, that might be the salary of a person I could bring in and that might be able to run, Jaeger, so we don't have to go buy a tool in the space, and they can also help with some other stuff. I think I think, one of the things that's really key to being a great DevOps engineer is being frugal, right? And that sucks as a vendor in the space, right? But like you don't have a big budget. You got to figure out like how to get the most bang for your buck out of the tools and people that you're hiring.
Yeah. I think that's why things like a land and expand strategy can be really important for platform engineering tools to get that initial foothold and prove value over time.
Yeah. How has the rise of cloud native technologies and Kubernetes influenced your investment strategy? Like there's a lot of tooling in the space now. Like how is that changing how you think about investments?
Well, yeah, I think Kubernetes has surpassed many people's expectations for its staying power. It's been about a decade now. So I think it's becoming more and more viable to build a company that is really based on Kubernetes and highly focused on it, or even being a pure play, Kubernetes company. If I look into the past at companies like, there have been companies like Rancher that have been successful in kind of abstracting on top of Kubernetes. There's been companies like Red Hat that were around well before Kubernetes, but definitely picked up the mantle and helped bring that project to life. But haven't been so many pure play Kubernetes companies have a super successful exit yet. I think in fact it's been maybe more of the ancillary services around Kubernetes that maybe have had some of the initial success of things like securing Kubernetes rather than like the actual dev tools on top of Kubernetes. So I think there's more and more opportunity for startups to purely focus on Kubernetes, but I think it's still kind of risky to have that be your only strategy in the long term. If you want to serve enterprise, they're not just going to be necessarily running on Kubernetes. It's important to be able to help people who just work on AWS natively and use VMs or whatever. So I don't. I still like to see companies that have a bit more flexibility to go beyond just Kubernetes, but certainly I think it will be around for a very long time. VMs are still around, mainframes are still around. I think over time, more and more, we'll start to see more pure play Kubernetes companies.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things that are new to do in the space, like startups that are in this space, in the DevOps and platform engineering space, what are some of the challenges that what are some of the common challenges that they're going to be facing, especially in like this new era of where it's harder to get venture capital, and how can they overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, just like we were talking about, it is a tricky space in terms of the go-to-market with selling to DevOps and engineers in a two-handed sales process. So I think it's important to be as crisp as you can and intentional upfront about how you set up your business model, and align that really well with your product. If you're selling to enterprises, they've made huge investments in their software development lifecycle and may be reticent to pull out, rip out everything. So a rip and replace strategy for enterprise, if you're an early stage startup, is a very tall order. And I think it's important if you're selling to enterprise to make a modular platform. So you can like at least give them the option to insert you in one particular part of their tool chain and then expand over time. But you still want to have enterprises also at the same time require a lot of depth of product. So you need to give them that option to have that full end-to-end automation as well. That can, that's easier said than done. But I think in general, the land and expand strategy is the best approach to take for enterprise. If you're selling to SMB, you might want to have, a clearer, simple pricing model. Their budget upfront. That's very transparent for them to see because they have super strapped budgets, and so like that will help a bit with the adoption. And I think if I think about like the product for platform engineering, and I think it's not enough to just provide configuration management for companies, for your customers. If you provide some type of opinionation on top of infrastructure, it's not going to be a huge leap up in productivity probably for developers. You're kind of making it a little bit easier for them to do making it easier for the developers to do the job that DevOps was doing, slightly simpler. But I think what really unlocks value is if you can get developers to build their own domain knowledge into the platform. And that's one of the things I think is great about Massdriver is how you guys have you provide the ability to be opinionated. The DevOps team or platform team can have the developers input very specific, like only the variables that they need to know about, and like help them with the configuration. But they also can build, use these building blocks to build abstractions that are closer to the business logic that they need. And that I think is what really actually will hook developers and make this more of a productivity play than just a governance play.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when you think about like the work that you do in the cloud, right? We've always had this with ops and dev, and then what became DevOps. Like there's these two teams that have to work together to get this stuff up and out, right? And it's really funny when you look at like thinking about like codifying, business needs into the platform. It's like when you look at almost any service in the cloud, there's a set of configurations there that are very much for the developer that the developer cares about. And then there's a set of configurations that are very much what the operator cares about, right? Like looking at like running a database, like, I want it to be highly available, like multi-zonal. Like, I don't think the developer cares so much as they're not getting woken up at 2 a.m. Like what they care about is like the version of Postgres or MySQL, right? And I feel like the unfortunate thing with like how we experience the cloud, when you have tools to developers, they're like, if you just give them Terraform or OpenTofu, like you hand it to them, they have to kind of learn all of these attributes, like all this configuration, right? There's so much for them to think about. When in reality, it's like they care about very few of the attributes of any given service of the cloud. They just want the thing to work. And they want it to be the version that they need for their application to work, right? And at the same time, ops is like, I want it to be secure and compliant and cost efficient. But like we have, this one tool for both of us to kind of, try to agree on. And I feel like that's very, very hard when you're just kind of handing developers the raw tools like Terraform, OpenTofu, Helm directly. Like there's so much of it you need to hide from them, because nothing you need to hide. I think if they want to learn it, that's great. We need more people to understand cloud, but like they only have 40 hours in their week. Like we can't, like, it's like they might want to learn it, but it's like, okay, well, learn it on your free time. Like, dude, get your work done and like get to your free time, right? Like you shouldn't be spending 10 hours of your week trying to understand like my side of the world's language to do your job. That's just kind of been my philosophy.
Yeah, I've definitely heard some objections from DevOps professionals that say, I don't need these platform engineering tools. We have infrastructure as code that spins up infrastructure, and they can just use these like basically take a almost scripting approach to this. And I think that works to an extent, but when you are hiring a lot of people it's more onboarding time if they don't know Terraform. It can be more brittle. So I think that that can work as a temporary solution, but there are more efficient ways to do it with some of the tools we're seeing in platform engineering.
Yeah. So you mentioned pricing a minute ago, and I would love to dig into that a bit more. When we went through Y Combinator, one of the first things they told us is your pricing, not to us directly, to everybody. It was like, your pricing's wrong, and that's fine. Like your pricing's going to change like 8 times, and I feel like I've gone through so much like pricing trauma to get to where we are today. But like it is very common, and if you're a startup today, your pricing's wrong. It's going to change. No, but if you haven't been told that, it's definitely wrong. But what are some of the monetization approaches you've seen be successful in the DevOps and the platform engineering space?
Yeah, I don't think there's one size fits all, and I think there's plenty of room for experimentation on pricing, especially in the early stages of a startup. When you're just getting started, you don't even necessarily have pricing on your webpage. You have development partners, and you're negotiating with them and giving them a nice price to start, and start working up from there of seeing what you can get. But I think it's important to think about all the tools that you have at hand. So you can price simply based on seats, but that may not always correlate to the value that you're getting, that the customer is getting. Sometimes say you want, pricing by seats may also limit the spread of your tool within an enterprise. So to counter that, you can sometimes have like a platform fee, like some upfront fee for using the platform, and make the per seat pricing a smaller, incremental charge on top. If your customers' usage varies a lot, and that usage is directly tied to your own costs as a startup, then a consumption-based business model is probably better. And you could do that on compute. You can do that on events. There are like lots of different ways you can do that. And there are tools out there that will also help you with like consumption billing, because there's a lot of custom logic that you have to build into that. It's also, I guess, depends on whether you are an open source project or not. And so when you have an open source strategy, it also is, again, you have to really decide what you put in to the product up front. So there's less room for experimentation there. But when I think about, maybe an example could be Cypress.io. Like they have an open source project where you can run tests, but if you want to parallelize your tests, you pay. And I think that's like I think that is seen by developers as fair. The open source product like works end to end. But if you really want that added speed, if you want like that can be an upsell. But it's not just speed. You can sell a lot of upsell. Will be, you see basic things like enterprise support, and there's various levels of support you can get all the way. You can send them to your community Slack channel, or you can have a dedicated Slack channel where you talk with them, or you can actually have a dedicated customer success rep who will hop on the phone anytime they want. People will put SSO is a super common upsell, but I think you have to be careful with that one. Some people really don't appreciate putting SSO as an upsell. They think you should have some. Oh. What do you think about this, Cory?
Yeah, I think Cypress actually has done a very thoughtful job of when they convert people to paying. This drives me nuts as like a operations engineer. I feel like a lot of things people will charge you for. It's like, I feel like they're really kind of sticking it to you, SSO included, right? It's like good security shouldn't be something you have to pay for, right? Like, I mean, and you could say maybe if you're selling like a Calendly or something like that, sure, if you want SSO to Calendly, you're gonna have to pay for it. But like when we're making security and we're making tools for operations folk, like that shouldn't be an option. Like it should just kind of come with it, right? And we had this very early on. Like we didn't want to charge per seat, because I've seen teams hit a seat max and like, okay, we'll just share passwords. And it's like, well, that undermines security, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting things that like people will reach for because they're like, oh, it's a measure of like how much somebody's using my product. But I think at the same time, I think as vendors, we have to think about like what are our values and like and morals and like what we stand for, and like does that pricing plan align with it, right? So I've seen people that say like they're going to make you more agile and they're going to make you more DevOps, right? And then they charge you based on deployments. And it's like, well, you just incentivized me to not make as many pull requests, right? So like you're going to impact my culture with this, right? So pricing is so hard. We definitely still haven't gotten it right. I'm sure we'll change it 8 more times on our path to Series A. But I think that a lot of times like people just kind of reach for that. Like, if you want SSO, you have to come to enterprise. And it's like security is becoming much more important early on. Like we shouldn't. That shouldn't be the thing that differentiates your enterprise product. That you should have some value in it, not baseline security.
Yeah, I think features would be the number one, most, appreciated, I guess, maybe in a way to say it, upsell from developers and DevOps teams, like security, governance, maybe being the next piece. And like the final piece that are probably least appreciated are like those arbitrary limits that like aren't necessarily tied to costs for the vendor. And SSO maybe is one example, although it falls in security, but it's like you've built it. Why don't you just let everyone use it? It's great, right? For people to have security, and you don't want your customers getting breached anyways. But there are other arbitrary. Sometimes tools will limit, like make it impossible for the product to be like persistent over a long period of time. Like the URLs will change or something like that. And those are strategies too, but like they tend to be a little less appreciated by the customers. But you definitely do see that as well.
Yeah. So I have a question I'd love to ask you, and it's an interesting one for me to ask, being that I'm involved in this one. But just speaking of pricing and open source, got me thinking about HashiCorp's recent change to the license of all their flagship OSS tools. So if people aren't familiar, they changed to the Busel license, which is source available. It has limitations on who can use it if they're direct competitors with HashiCorp. Has this impacted VC's views on OSS investments at all? And if so, how?
I think it's happened in the past. It's happening. It's happening now, and it will happen again. And it's not pretty. I think from the HashiCorp perspective, you would expect there to be backlash, but I think they also learned, the importance of communicating this really clearly. I think it's a challenge for them to do so. In their subsequent blog posts that they came out with more clarifications. Maybe some of that should have been put up front, but at the same time, I understand it's hard for them to they probably don't have an incentive to directly identify all of their competitors. So they had the nice call in and ask us approach, which is, difficult to see how people will actually, if people will actually do that. I think it's risky it just shows that it is risky to depend on open source software from a commercial vendor if you are operating in their orbit and could potentially be competitive. I think it shows that HashiCorp is nervous about some of these startups operating in its space. And if I look at like a past example, like MongoDB changed their open source license back in 2018, and I think that was more about cloud providers. But this is a case where I think it's more focused potentially on the startups. So, that's one interesting difference, but, so there's definitely risk. There's risk to startups operating on those open source tools. And, it's going to be a painful process if you have to make a license change. Sometimes it's, maybe the best economic decision for the business, but, I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt that they just didn't foresee this until later. But it would have been better if they could have been more intentional up front and just, not had to make the license change. But, sometimes that happens.
Yeah, and it's funny from like a business standpoint, like it makes sense. Like I mean, that's the right business decision to make, right? Like I mean, at the end of the day, we're here to drive shareholder value, right? Like, but it's funny. It's like we're going through some stuff that we're about to be open sourcing now, and like we're considering. I mean, not that we're considering Boostle, but it's like we're trying to figure out like what licensing is right. Like the lawyers obviously have opinions, but I think that we're pretty dedicated to open source. Like, our entire team's built our careers on it, right? And we want to make sure that we're picking licensing that's makes developers comfortable. And it's funny, for like the longest time, I felt like developers didn't care so much. They just grab something and throw it in there and use it. If you're a bigger company, you're like, no, I'm not here. Yeah, I know at bigger companies, if you're at Lockheed, you very much care about the licensing. But like, in startups, like people aren't paying attention to it, but like people know now. Like people are very familiar with like the differences between MIT and GPL and Apache. So it's interesting to see like developers starting to be concerned with the license they have, because they've, run into this with Elasticsearch and Mongo and Red Hat and now HashiCorp. And I'm really curious if it's going to change like the way we do open source, right? Like I think that some of these tools, you get to a point where it becomes so important to the ecosystem, right? Like, and not just like the ecosystem like their small orbit, but like the grander ecosystem, right? Like the HashiCorp changes impacted the CNCF. Like they changed out a bunch of tooling because of the change, right? And so I'm almost curious if we'll start to see more projects like leaning towards foundations earlier, and if there's like a right time to put something into one of these foundations, like Linux Foundation, to make sure that like it stays vendor independent and make sure that it really becomes something that the community owns versus an organization. But it is, I think it's a very, very interesting time. And that was, it was sad for me to see. It makes sense onto why they did it. But I'm really curious what some of these open source projects are going to be doing moving forward. If they're going to be kind of following suit for some of the ones that are getting more powerful and more adopted.
Yeah, curious to see how they actually go about enforcing this. I'm not sure if I've heard any rumors of them actually starting to go after startups yet or sue anyone, but so I think we still need to wait and see how this plays out for them. But I don't know. Have you heard anything on your end of people actually getting chased after, or and I'd also be curious, just the latest on OpenTofu.
I'd say I haven't, and I mean, we were obviously on their radar. But I think that they made a business decision, but I still think that this is a business decision, very financial decision. But I think at the heart of HashiCorp, like it's still run by good people, right? And I think they probably did this, and they know that people will go and they will stop doing it, right, or move or shift or pivot, right. I can't imagine that they would throw stones at startups and actually go after people. I mean, I would be very surprised if that happened. Now, if they were maybe going after AWS, like resource manager or something like that, right? Like I could see that being viable, but I don't think they're going to, necessarily come after some of the smaller ones. Now, maybe they have that in their pocket for, when they IPO, right? Maybe that's what it is, but I don't think that I couldn't imagine that they would.
Let's hope.
We were a part of OpenTofu along with some other really great companies like Spacelift, M0, Harness, Gruntwork. One of those companies that I think really defined this space, right? Like HashiCorp built the tools, but Gruntwork did a lot of the work to get the community here. So OpenTofu is going great. We had the first GA release a few weeks back, so it's up, been stable. It's got feature compatibility. We've had a lot of, kind of legal hurdles thrown in the way. So, OpenTofu can't use the Terraform registry, so they did change the licensing on that as well. So we had to go build a registry, and we open sourced it. It's fantastic. So it's out there. It's a serverless registry. You can run it internally if you want. So we had to build our own registry. So a lot of people kind of see our progress as a bit slow. But we've maintained feature compatibility with Terraform, and we're doing that through reverse engineering. We've got a strict policy of not accessing any of their source code, and in the meantime, it's like we've gotten the Linux Foundation, we've got our application done for the CNCF. We had to build this registry, we've maintained feature compatibility, and we've added features that aren't in Terraform, like Terraform state encryption, right? This is something that people have been waiting for years. Just basic encryption around our state files, which are the old secrets and information that shouldn't necessarily be easily accessible. So I think that we've had amazing progress, and what's really exciting recently, I can share this in the show notes as well. The State of OSS report showed that there's already like 8% of people surveyed have adopted OpenTofu internally. I think Terraform is sitting around like 22%. So
Wow.
OpenTofu has reached almost where Pulumi is. So, I mean, you're seeing, kind of big companies adopting this. GitLab recently announced that they're going to be replacing all their Terraform templates with OpenTofu. So I think that people are concerned, are concerned with the license change, even if they're not directly impacted by it. So I think it's exciting, and it's bittersweet for me, honestly. Like I love open source, and I don't think that we were necessarily, as a company, that we were necessarily impacted by the change because we compete with a different product of HashiCorp, so it was a cutout for us. So like I wanted to be a part of this because I was just like, I felt like it was a little bit of turning backs on the people that built up this community, but at the same time, it's like I don't want to see a fractured community, right? And so like now we're kind of entering, an interesting space. It's like we're committed to keeping feature compatibility with Terraform, but we're also building our own features, right? So like if you use OpenTofu, that's great, but like we're not backwards compatible now, right? Like if you start using OpenTofu and you're encrypting your state, and then let's say your organization requires you to go back to Terraform for some reason, like you have to now take away that layer of security, which I think is it's disappointing to me as somebody who's concerned about security and operations. And so it just sucks to think like these two groups of people are going to be kind of having, I don't want to say, I hate the term like Cold War, because I don't think there's, on our side, there's really not any animosity. I mean, it's a group of competitors that all get along very well, funny enough. But like we're going to have two groups of people kind of trying to implement this same standard, if you will, of like how this thing works. And I'm sure that now that we've implemented state encryption, you'll probably see it happen in Terraform finally, right? And so like it just seems to me like a monumental waste of effort, right? Like it's one thing for two open source projects in the same space that have very different use cases, right? Pulumi and Terraform and Winglang. Yeah, let's have all three of those. Like they're three very different ideas. That's exciting, but like two groups of people that are literally just doing the same thing is kind of a bummer to me. So I don't know how it can go. I would love to still see like some way to bring the community back together. That's my personal take, and I hope that it gets there. And I would welcome HashiCorp with open arms. I'm not sure necessarily if everybody in the OpenTofu space would, or how that would look, but I mean that's kind of what I hope happens. I hope that we kind of all see this as ridiculous. There's a big pie to bake here. I mean, the funny thing is like I feel like we're all kind of fighting over pennies. It seems like a crazy thing to say given HashiCorp's market cap, but like if you look at the State of CD report last year, only 27% of companies are doing infrastructure as code, and the winner is still Ansible, right? So it's just like there's a lot of people left to sell to. I don't know why we need to like fight over the people that we have today. It's like there's a huge market out there, and so I feel like there could have been a better way to look at how to do this and how to move forward with it. And I think that we are where we are, and that sucks. And I hope that it reconverges at some point in time. But we've got great progress in the meantime, and we got great adoption. We've got a day at KubeCon next week, so there's OpenTofu Day. So it's all very exciting, but yeah, it's a little bittersweet at the same time.
Yeah, painful situation, but it is remarkable how the community, people like you, have come together to lead the charge on this. So kudos for that.
Yeah, it was funny. We were at reInvent, and Spacelift was like 5 booths down from us, and I was wearing a Massdriver shirt, and one of their employees was wearing a Spacelift shirt, and we're talking and just kind of bullshitting. And somebody comes by and like looks at us, just like a random person. They're like, "Aren't you guys competitors?" And we're like, "Yeah, we're friends too. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I mean, I think it's good to discuss ideas, and we're doing things very different. We have very different target audiences that we're trying to sell to. So, but
when the aliens come, humanity unites. So
yeah. If everybody could just be as welcoming and forgiving as the IAC community. Oh, geez. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. We want to ask two last questions, just both very short. What's a tool or service that you've seen recently that you're excited about?
Recently, I saw a very cool demo for a database company called Tiger Beetle. And it's for financial accounting. So if you think about banks and payments companies that have to handle double ledger accounting, they're like kind of there's a problem with the issues with consistency, right, and potential like durability. What can happen if you have a failure mode and you updated one account but not the other, right? So banks build a lot of custom logic into their databases to like account, to actually have this accounting logic. But the thought with Tiger Beetle is to have these abstractions natively in the database, and on top of that, be highly performant. It's written in some programming language called Zig that I've started to hear a lot about. I don't know too much about it. I don't know if you've come across it, but seems a little bit hyped up and interesting.
Yeah, that is cool. I have heard of Zig. I think I have not used it. I think I've seen a terminal application that was written in it recently, but I've definitely heard it a couple of times. That's very cool. Awesome. Last question. Where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter, Colton Dempsey. I'd encourage founders to reach out. We invest primarily at Series A stage and later in B2B tech companies. And we also have some services that we provide to our portfolio, just to put that out there. We help a lot with go-to-market. We have a 10-person in-house go-to-market team that generates qualified leads for our portfolio companies. We've closed over 300 deals on behalf of our portfolio, and have millions of dollars of bookings for individual companies. One example, Sysdig, we helped them land one of their largest customers and have booked millions of dollars for them, and numerous other companies. So would encourage you to get in touch.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, and hope to have you back sometime soon.
Yeah, talk again soon. Thanks, Cory.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Platform Engineering Podcast. Have a topic you would love to learn more about? Let us know at Cory@massdriver.cloud. That's CORY@MASSDRIVER.cloud. Catch you on the next one.